John, Merry Christmas.
Hey, George. Merry Christmas to you. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm on vacation
Oh, good.
from Stevens. Had the last exam, got it graded, all the grades in for my 3 courses. So I'm feeling pretty good
must
about
feel
that.
good.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a long time.
Yeah. I just checked the Blogging Heads website, and our last chat was 3 months ago in late September.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, so...
What did it say we talked about?
Let me... shit, I can't remember.
No, that was a trick question.
I actually looked at the menu, but but I didn't absorb it. I should warn you that this is my nap time. It's 3:00 in the afternoon. We usually do these earlier in the day.
That's true.
And my blood sugar is low, so if I seem a little sleepy or even more addled than normal,
More
that's
addled than usual. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's my excuse. Ay. So, what have you been up to? And I don't know if you wanted to start with this, but I guess it's too late now. I just read, before anybody else on the planet except your editors at the New York Times, I guess, your next post, which I loved, on Pavlov in particular and neuroscience in general. Very cool.
Yeah. It's just Pavlov was so amazing, and people really, I think, underestimate him because they, really what most people know, including me until recently, is just the old stereotype about Pavlov's dogs and salivating at the sound of a bell, and he was a much more sophisticated thinker, and I've written about that before in my book 10 Most Beautiful Experiments, and then one of my best source on Pavlov then was this historian of science named Daniel Toads at Johns Hopkins, and he's just written this monumental biography of Pavlov that really brings home these points. So I kind of used his book as an excuse to get into this. And then talk about the bigger issue of how much do we really know about the brain that Pavlov didn't know more than a century ago.
You must have seen the piece in the New Yorker within the last few weeks, I guess it was.
Yeah, it was a really good review.
And it made me think, and actually the New Yorker has had a couple of other articles like this on historical figures and showing that the way that they are used in most historical accounts is not accurate or is really incomplete in a significant way. The one that I remember before this was Herbert Spencer, who is he's this 19th century Victorian era scientist, philosopher, who's associated with social Darwinism. I think he coined the term survival of the fittest.
And
according to this essay in the New Yorker, he actually was not really a social Darwinist. He was very progressive in his thinking. He was not somebody who just said that the rich and powerful deserve to be rich and powerful and should prevail over the weak. And this piece on Pavlov, this essay that I read in the New Yorker, and I guess this is the theme of the
this was a review of the book by Michael Spector. Michael Spector is a great science writer and just a great writer in general. And I was just looking it up, and it's great. The headline is "Drool."
Yeah, right.
Ivan Pavlov's Real Quest, but and then just how people really misunderstand Pavlov, and it's kind of similar to the case you just mentioned with Spencer, which I don't know anything about. I must have missed that piece, but with Pavlov, everyone lumps him together with the behaviorists,
right?
B.F. Skinner and Watson, and he was not a behaviorist at all, and he very much believed he was really just kind of poking at the surface of some complex phenomenon called the mind, but that he was just looking for ways that you could get at it experimentally and quantifiably.
So normally when you see him, he's used as a kind of placeholder for this extremely reductionist thinking about how the brain works, that it's just
Yeah,
a very complicated machine, and that once we understand it in detail, we'll see that it's very deterministic and there's no free will and there's no
right,
room,
right.
obviously, for the soul or any of these ineffable um,
It's all
entities that,
huge chains of response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response.
yeah.
But yeah,
And,
not at all. He was, this was just, he just realized that the only way he was going to be able to make any progress in understanding what he could was with things that you could experimentally measure. But that didn't mean that he was mistaking what you could measure for what's real.
yeah. I mean, so I think in your piece, you made an analogy to some of his remarks to William James.
Yeah, yeah,
And it did sound like, and James was somebody who had a vague idea about creating a scientific psychology and finding the equivalent of the atoms of the mind and so forth, but pretty early on in his career despaired of whether that was possible
yeah.
and seemed to suggest that in some ways the mind might not be reducible, at least in the same way that certain phenomena in biology and physics are reducible.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
there,
fascinating that
yeah.
Pavlov seemed to be saying something kind of similar to that.
Well, yeah. I mean, and then on the other hand, he didn't have any mystical ideas about the mind as being like some kind of separate essence. He wasn't a dualist, and let's see if I can find. Yeah, my favorite quote that I used in my column is. Yeah, this is Pavlov. The movement of plants toward the light in the seeking of truth through a mathematical analysis. Are these not phenomena belonging to the same order? And
That
are they
is
not the last links in an almost endless chain of adaptabilities which appear everywhere in living creatures? I mean,
that's
wow.
really that's really profound. I'm not sure if I interpreted that correctly, but it reminded me of some models in neuroscience that that show how, for example, when somebody's throwing us a ball and instantly our minds are calculating the trajectory so that we can catch the ball, that we are in a way that our minds are performing very rapid mathematical calculations. Of course,
Oh,
we're totally
yeah,
unaware of them. But is that
yeah.
do you think that is that in any way like what Pavlov is trying to suggest with that quote?
I was taking him to say something very different, which is just that that there's nothing mystical and spooky about, say, the creativity of solving a mathematical theorem or this very high level thinking. That it all comes down to things that are going on in the brain, processes that can, at least in principle, be understood. So he
Yeah.
was saying that there is this complex brain mind thing, but that it was accessible to science, and that we weren't some exalted creatures. I mean, we're exalted in the sense that we have these amazingly evolved brains, but at the same time, it's not like we have something extra and mystical called the mind.
Was he
I mean, that's
religious?
how I took him to mean by that.
Was he? Do you know? Was he religious, or was he an ardent communist and atheist? Or
Well, one of the interesting things about this new biography is it gets into his dealings with the Communist Party, because he had started his work and was working through the era of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then and he had some very very complex relationship with the with the Kremlin,
Mhm.
and on one hand he had to be accommodating enough to keep getting funding for his this big institute in St. Petersburg, um, or Leningrad as it was for a while, and but at the same time he was very very critical of the regime, and got away with quite a lot because he was this revered figure before the Bolshevik Revolution. And in the early 20th century, Pavlov got a Nobel Prize, but it was for his work on digestion.
Aha.
And so he went from understanding digestion to trying to understand the mind, which is one reason why he got in through this odd route of measuring salivation in dogs.
I probably shouldn't ask this a question like this because I have no idea. I'm sort of I'm reaching here, but was his work inspirational at all? You know, the communist Russians got really excited about cybernetics. This idea,
right.
It was a field created by the term was coined by Norbert Wiener, an American scientist, but the Soviet Union was really enthusiastic about it because it suggested that all systems, whether animate or inanimate, could be seen as these complex machines that could be, once you understood them properly, could be controlled. And it seems to me that Pavlov's...
Or to give it a more positive spin, that, enlightened, that people could be improved. And that the lower classes could be brought up from, and educated and, enlightened with the great principles of Marx and Engels,
right.
But that the brain was adaptable.
Yeah. So was Pavlov?
That fits right in with with viewing the mind not as this not as something mystical.
Right, and as you said, stimulus response, a stimulus response device.
Yeah, but at the same time, not just this simple, knee-jerk stimulus response device, but that there's, he believed that there was cognition going on inside. So it wasn't like, Skinner and Watson, who seemed to just really, just reject the idea of the mind as just being kind of folk psychology because it couldn't be reached through science, and that everything was just behavior.
Yeah. By the way, we should. Some people might be confused when we refer to Watson that we're talking about the co-discoverer of the double helix, and it's not that Watson. It's a much earlier figure. I think it's J.B. Watson. Are the initials, who actually was. I think he was a scientist and also somebody who was big in the advertising industry.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, that's my vague recollection. I might be disseminating misinformation out there. But
okay, Watson. We should know this stuff. It's one of these things we probably won't see. John B. Watson died in 1958.
Did he ever?
Well, anyway, the Little Albert experiment. Yeah, okay. But anyway, so I don't remember if he was in advertising.
So here's my next question about Pavlov is, what were his thoughts about free will? Was that something that he worried about, gave a lot of thought to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, he was in advertising. Okay, there's a whole section on him in Wikipedia.
Isn't that classic though? That one of the great figures in psychology was also, I think, a pioneer in advertising. I mean, talk about stimulus response.
Yeah, it kind of figures.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So Pavlov. Free will?
So Pavlov and free will. Let's see. There was something interesting I read about that. Just a minute. I'm trying to. I mean, I think. God, it's in Toad's book, and I'm not going to say anything because I forget. Okay, so here, wait, I'm finding this from Spector's review because I've forgotten. Let's see. It says Skinner and other behaviorists often spoke of their debt to Pavlov, particularly his view that free will was an illusion and that the study of human behavior could be reduced to the analysis of observable, quantifiable events and action. But this goes on to say, Spector does, but Pavlov never held such views. And then he quotes, then he gets into the biography,
right,
by Daniel Toad. So, you could see why someone would assume that was the case.
Sure.
Yeah, but again, he had a much more sophisticated idea than that and I imagine was as baffled by free will as anyone, because, if you look at the brain as a completely deterministic machine, no matter how complex it is and unfathomable because of its, deep layers of complexity, still, to have it's hard to imagine a theory in which you can believe in free will without believing in a separate mind and becoming, what the philosophers call a substance dualist. And yet, I don't think you're a substance dualist, and you've written a lot of things passionately arguing that how ridiculous it is to say we don't have free will.
Yeah, it's just it's a kind of causality that we haven't figured out yet. It's there's this emergent property that comes out of the activities of certain kinds of matter, especially this chunk of stuff inside our skulls, that allows us to recognize different options when we're looking into the future and choose among them. So that is not something that is reducible to physics. It introduces an element of psychology into the system, and it's still based in physical processes, but somehow it is not reducible to them. You have to you have to look at psychological explanations and look at human values and look at human reason.
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah, all of that goes into it, but then, ultimately you're going to have to, process this all as electrochemical signals and networks of neurons, right?
Yeah, except then one of the best.
That's what's baffling.
One of the best explanations I heard for this was from a Santa Fe person, and I forget who it was, unfortunately. And I don't think the idea was original to him, but it's the idea of downward causation. So normally,
right.
You normally think of reductionism as suggesting that processes at the smallest scales sort of percolate up in their results and their effects up to higher levels. When in fact, then sometimes you have these emergent phenomena. The mind is the most obvious example that can exert effects going down in the other direction on the neural activity and so forth. Something like that. Again, it's very hand wavy, but something like that, I would assume, has to be the case.
That's the thing when you get, it does become hand wavy because you get down to this ultimate question of, at what point, what's making this decision, if not the brain? And if the brain is this complex electrochemical device and there's no such thing as a separate mind, how do you resolve that? But and of course, with reductionism, it's basically that you can reduce any phenomenon downward to simpler principles, but being able to reduce downward doesn't mean that you can explain by going upward. So, like, you can't go from the periodic table itself to, explain the physical world as it exists on Earth.
Right.
It's just like this. Well, what Murray Gell-Mann would, often, as he often put it, it's like this mixture of the basic fundamental laws of physics and frozen accidents, the contingencies of history and the way things happen to crystallize out by chance, from the many different possible ways that they could manifest themselves. So, apparently you still can't come up with an airtight set of equations involving, quantum mechanics, I guess Lagrangian equations, that explain an atom more complex than hydrogen. Once you get to helium, you get so many layers of complexity.
Right.
And you get into the whole problem, with the three-body problem. And then as you get more and more complex atoms and molecules, forming living tissues, in principle, it can all be reduced to quarks and gluons and leptons. But you can't go from there, to get to us.
Right. Another great physicist who used to be at the Santa Fe Institute, Phil Anderson, he expressed this in this essay that goes back to the 1970s. More is different.
Yeah.
And which suggests that, what I loved about it is that here's a guy who won a Nobel Prize for what Murray Gell-Mann would call squalid state physics.
Right.
But, he is a really good reductionist, this guy.
Yeah. Anderson.
Yeah, he was a genius in understanding superconductivity and showing how quantum mechanics could explain a wide variety of really peculiar solid-state phenomena. But he said physicists have gone too far in saying that everything ultimately should be reducible to physics.
Yeah.
And he became almost an enemy of particle physics at one point because he said that all the talk about a theory of everything and a God particle, some of the hyperbole that was coming out of particle physics a few decades ago was ridiculous because particle physics would provide little or no insight into biological phenomena, for example, let alone human psychology and social science and things like that.
Yeah. But of course, you can hold that position, which I think is obviously true, and at the same time, not think that there's anything other than mass and energy.
Yeah.
That it all does ultimately come down to quarks, gluons, leptons, and photons, various kinds of energy. It all comes down to what bosons and fermions, but that doesn't mean that you can explain at these higher levels. I mean, maybe there's some, great Laplacian brain that could keep track of all of this and do the quantum calculations and, understand, a living creature in terms of all the particles, but it's certainly beyond any human capacities.
Well,
but some would argue that there's no such thing as even, like a hypothetical super brain that in principle could understand at that level.
Laplace's demon. Maybe in addition to the fermions and the bosons and all the ons that you mentioned, there are also the psychons. Some kind of fundamental bits of consciousness that you also have to assume are elementary particles of reality. And another Santa Fe person who I've just recently been corresponding with because I'm trying to get him to do a Q&A for my Scientific American blog. Stuart Kaufman is thinking along these lines. So he just sent me an essay that I forget if he wrote it or co-wrote it. Anyway, it's his latest thoughts. I guess Stu has been obsessed about consciousness and free will lately. And his latest thoughts are that consciousness does have something to do, or probably does, something to do with quantum mechanics. It's that old idea that somehow quantum indeterminacy plays some role in free will and agency, or our ability to determine our own course through physical reality. As I was,
it's like Roger Penrose.
Yeah. It's similar to that. That's what Stu was saying.
I mean, Penrose got a lot of grief.
Absolutely.
Over that from cognitive scientists, we talked. I think back when we talked in September, we got into panpsychism, that idea that there's something basic and irreducible. Oh yeah, because actually I wrote one of my raw data columns. I was getting into that recent book by Thomas Nagel, the philosopher.
Yes.
Where he's arguing that, and then just considering this idea that there's some kind of basic missing ingredient to our understanding of the cosmos, and that mind actually can't even be reduced in principle to quarks and gluons and everything else, but that there's actually something in addition, and that in addition, you can give it this kind of fake name or psychons without having any idea what a psychon would be, but just this hypothetical particle of something like consciousness. Yeah, we did when we talked about David Chalmers, the philosopher who's thinks this,
and Christoph Koch. who's had, is like one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. He was a partner of Francis Crick in making consciousness a topic for serious scientific discussion about 25 years ago, and he's been writing about panpsychism lately. So
it's definitely it's enjoying it's enjoying some attention, but I can see why people would really recoil against the idea, but.
Well, I think Deepak Chopra is also into panpsychism, and I see that as not such a good thing, actually. So.
Well, no, but I mean, you can, that can be true, and you can still have people who have nothing to do with him or his ideas, and that are approaching it, from an entirely different direction. But I mean, I'm of course, I'm, like most people, skeptical of the idea, but I'm intrigued.
I think we've said before. Well, I've said before, if there is some kind of really, really groundbreaking, if it's some true revolution in science or huge paradigm shift, that this is the realm where it will be in. The attempt to understand consciousness in physical terms. It's I think it's the oldest. It's certainly one of the oldest problems that people have ever thought about. Socrates thought about the mind-body problem, and we're still worried about it today. And what's distressing is, panpsychism is something that Plato and Socrates talked about.
Yeah,
panpsychism is you can find it in Buddhist doctrine.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary to me that you see science as a process of rising above superstition, and in this one realm, you still have serious scientists and scholars toying with these millennia old concepts. It's amazing.
It's different though. I mean, before go somewhere. In 20th century neuroscience, when the idea of dualism, that you could have, that the mind was some separate essence, separate from the brain, became completely discredited. And neuroscience is all based on a monistic idea that everything, can be explicable at least in principle, in terms, of the brain, physical processes of the brain. So when people are talking about psychons, it's not like they're going back to the old, dualist idea of saying that there's going to be this mystical kind of mind that's outside the realm of scientific inquiry. They're saying that, we're going to find out that there's some other kind of particle, maybe in such a way that expands our very notion of particle in something fundamental. But again, it's going to be subsumed into science. It's not going to stand outside and be separate, but of course, there's nothing like that has happened. It's still just all speculation. So I guess in that case, it's not so different from dualism.
And it might be a science that, in some ways, is not to be too grandiose about it, incommensurable with past scientific notions of how brains give rise to minds. It might be something as dramatic as the quantum revolution, moving away from classical physics toward quantum mechanics and relativity.
Wow.
But who the hell knows?
That's what's so fascinating about it is, it's really weird when you think about it that, consciousness is everything.
Yeah.
To us, we would, that's all science and all human endeavor arises because of this weird thing called consciousness and this feeling of, knowing that you're alive, knowing that and it's ultimately mysterious. And you can say, well, yes, in principle, it's all reducible, to the brain. And, well, yeah, in principle, but, what does that mean? But it's interesting that, that what's really the most important phenomenon, the one from which our whole, everything arises, is something we don't understand, then it's hard to imagine that it would ever be different. I mean, what would a theory of consciousness look like? That's something I keep getting back to, where you'd see something, whether it's a set of equations or a computer model or something, or it's all written by some good popular science writer into prose, and you would read this and go, "Oh yeah, that's what consciousness is." Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Finally, we realize this, and I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah, well, now you're raising the question of, to me, you're talking about the aesthetics of a scientific explanation. When do you decide when an explanation is really satisfying, where you can kind of go, okay, that nails it. This phenomenon is no longer mysterious to me. I mean, you can get that with heredity. You got it with photosynthesis, with these formerly really strange, mysterious phenomena.
Yeah.
And yet they were reduced eventually through physics and chemistry and so forth. And the idea is that could happen with consciousness. What I think is kind of funny is that you have these preemptive strikes by certain people in this whole area of the mind-body problem. There, for example, Daniel Dennett in Consciousness Explained, basically his explanation was to say that consciousness is an illusion. All there is matter. Consciousness is epiphenomenal. It's not really necessary.
It's kind of a serial processor running by simulation on top of a parallel processor.
Right.
It's a brilliant book, and
it is a brilliant book. But what's bizarre about it to me is that it's you were just saying, in a way, I mean, there's an ancient philosophical position which says that mind is all there is.
Yeah.
I mean, if we really want to be sticklers about it, solipsism is a correct philosophical position.
Oh, sure, yeah, the brain in the vat.
Right, yeah. And so, it's insane to try to solve the mind-body problem by saying that mind is really just sort of a side effect of matter. I mean, you can make the opposite argument, right?
I mean, it just seems like a good working assumption. So you can go on and do all this really interesting neuroscience, and then let certain people that want to, tackle the so-called hard problem of consciousness, like David Chalmers or Penrose, or now I guess Stu Kaufman.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and of course there were other approaches that were more, I don't know what you'd call them, more down to earth. Crick and Christoph Koch's thing with, consciousness having something to do with a certain frequency. Was it 50?
40 hertz oscillation.
40 hertz, where everything kind of the binding problem.
Right.
Like how, the vision. We look out the window and we hear the wind whistling, and we see things and we smell things, and somehow this is all bound together by the brain into this, moment of consciousness, and they were trying to show it had something to do with this 40-cycle rhythm in the brain. But, whether it does or whether it doesn't, it's not like you're going to, understand that or something like it and then say, oh, yeah, that's what consciousness is. It was just one tiny piece of a puzzle.
Yeah, it's going to be an engineering diagram that's qualitatively not that different from what you'd have for, I don't know, like a Lexus or an air conditioner or something.
It's not like you're going to, or an espresso machine.
Right.
I was just looking at one of those recently, trying to fix my espresso machine. But, it's not like you're going to look at it and you're going to go, yeah, damn, okay,
a toaster
now I
oven.
get it.
It would only work, though, if it.
I actually had that feeling. I'm sorry, I'm talking over you.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I actually had that feeling when I read Dan Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, and I reviewed it for the New York Times book review, and they actually put it on. It was like the lead review on the cover.
Uh-huh.
I think that's the only time. No, it's only happened to me. Well, only once when it was the lead review on the cover. I done a couple of other reviews that got on the cover, but that was a great feeling. So I have it framed in my hallway. And when Dennett was here with his wife a few years ago, when he was at the Santa Fe Institute for a brief stint, we had him over for dinner, and I showed him that I had this framed, and he got a kick out of that.
Wow.
But
yeah,
I remember reading this book and just thinking, wow, and it made me understand a lot more than I did. And really, I closed the book thinking, wow, I think I really understand consciousness, but it quickly faded. And
right.
yeah,
it's funny how that happens. Sometimes there's some writers that I have this paradoxical reaction to them. Bob Wright does this to me a little bit sometimes. Mm-hmm. They are so clever, and they're so good at arguing, mm-hmm. and they just have such verbal command that I'm suspicious of them. The more mm-hmm. persuasive I find them, the more I think that they're pulling a fast one on me. And Dan Dennett has always had that effect on me. So in a way, the more I'm carried away by what he writes, the more I'm thinking this has got to be wrong on some level, and I'm really looking hard for the flaws in his logic.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to bring up another topic since it's the end of the year, and I think this mm-hmm. is kind of a natural segue. In a way, we're talking about the ultimate scientific problem, trying to understand ourselves. If we did have a really powerful neural theory of consciousness in principle, and this is something we've talked about in the past many times, in principle, that could have immense practical consequences. You can really get into neural engineering. You can get into interfaces between brains and electronic digital devices and so forth. We're already seeing the beginnings of those sorts of technologies, paralyzed people being able to control computers and so forth. And, so this kind of science brings up all these possible future scenarios where we redesign ourselves in various ways. And, it's the realm of science fiction, but also of science nonfiction, where scientists are trying to look ahead. And I just read a book that was of that nonfiction genre of science by Edward Wilson, the great Harvard biologist. His latest book is called The Meaning of Human Existence, which is, I wrote a review for Scientific American, and I said, Edward Wilson is one of the few people who can get away with a title like that. The Meaning of Human Existence, give me a break. But it's really, I'm a huge fan of Ed Wilson.
Yeah.
And this book is short and sweet and really packed with deep ideas, and he's basically trying to lay out what we know about ourselves and about our reality scientifically, and then to project into the future and say it's time for us to start thinking about what sort of future we want. And it's it's, to me it's really exciting because he comes down on the side of optimism, and not just kind of timid, moderate optimism that we're gonna make progress against our problems. He uses the term paradise, and he says that, this is from somebody who's repudiated religion, but he's saying that he thinks we should start thinking about how we can create paradise on Earth, and he thinks that is quite possible, even possibly soon, maybe by the end of this century. And I just love that. I love the optimism of that.
Yeah, I want to read this.
Yeah,
I could use some optimism.
Yeah, Wilson is he's not. He actually rejects a couple of science-inspired futures that are very popular these days. So one that you hear a lot about, and it's a constant in films also, is the idea that we're going to fan out into space and create and populate new worlds, colonize other planets. Yeah. So, have you seen the movie Interstellar?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can recommend it that much. I liked it, but it's pretty hokey, and the idea is that colonizing or creating colonies in space, the old Gerard O'Neill style, huge orbiting spaceships or going to other star systems, that is our future.
Yeah.
And Wilson, and it wasn't just in this new book. He also discussed this in his last book, The Social Conquest of Earth. He says that we shouldn't be taking that seriously. Obviously, this is our home, and we shouldn't indulge in these escapist fantasies of going to other planets. And I think he's absolutely right. I'm sort of embarrassed by. I mean, I love sci-fi, but I'm embarrassed when serious people ask us to take seriously the idea that our best hope is to go to other planets.
Well, yes, it's kind of a defeatist kind of attitude. When we're done trashing this one, we'll move on to the next.
Right. And so Wilson he's basically saying we've got to, he's been a champion of biodiversity for many decades.
Right.
He's a leader in the movement to first chart all the organisms on Earth and then to do our best to
put it on the map.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a great, really admirable figure in that area. But then he also addresses what I don't think he uses the term singularity, but he addresses the idea, which is also very popular, that we are going to engineer ourselves, engineer our bodies in ways that we can overcome our problems.
I know you're really impressed by that.
Yeah. Although, he's got, what is he called? Something conservatism. He coins a term, existential conservatism, I think, is the term. And he's basically saying that he doesn't think it's a good idea to radically engineer ourselves, either our brains or our genes, and, because he thinks that it's the effects could be too unpredictable.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that kind of engineering can be stopped, but I do think it's absurd to believe that also could be our best hope.
I mean, if it happens, it's going to be the same thing with space travel, where it'll be something that's done by, for the entertainment of rich people.
Right. Yeah.
That's certainly the way things seem to be going, and this is not something that's going to help the human condition in general. I mean, it's so weird to even be thinking about that. When you think of the state of the world today with the Ebola epidemic in Africa, and just the huge problems of poverty and population growth
and war,
ISIS,
Syria, terrorism. Right.
Yeah. And then you have people talking about getting brain implants or uploading all of our consciousness to some big computer so we become immortal. And, that's, great fun stuff to think about, but it's really hard to take it very seriously.
Yeah. You have written about this at least tangentially in a couple of your recent columns, which I really liked. I forget which one came first, but so one was the one on the Anasazi.
The Anasazi and climate change.
Yeah. And, because obviously climate change is one of the big problems that we have to fix if we're going to create this paradise on Earth that Ed Wilson is talking about. So when you contemplate the Anasazi, does that make you, do you think that ultimately our great empire is going to go the way of the Anasazi? Does it make you depressed or upbeat, or how does it leave you?
Well, in some ways, the Anasazis, are kind of a popular. I mean, kind of a encouraging story. And so the Anasazi, just as a little instant background, where the people, the ancestors to today's Pueblo Indians who occupied the great stone cities of Mesa Verde and who built the architecture at Chaco Canyon and other sites in the Southwest, and then somewhere in what in what we of European descent call medieval times, around 1100, 1200, there came this great drought, has been the theory, and then the Anasazi abandoned all of these these great cities that they had built and sort of scattered across the Southwest and absorbed with some other settlements that already existed and started new ones. But they didn't disappear, is the point. People talk about the disappearance of the Anasazi, but they dispersed and reassembled into a new form.
Yeah.
Which is what a lot kind of the consensus of archaeology. They differ a lot on the details, including how much of the abandonment of their original settlements was based on climate and how much climate was just kind of a trigger, that led to other things. But, so that's kind of a positive story in a way.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about it in that, in that context, but.
Well, because so the way that normally these bygone civilizations, that their story is framed, is the way I think that Jared Diamond framed them in his great book, Collapse, that they're cautionary tales, and that we're going to go the same way that they went if we don't do something about our environmental problems in particular.
Well, yeah, and that's a good that's a good lesson to take from history, because it certainly happens. And in one of the theory with the Anasazi is that they overfarmed their lands, and then and depleted the soil, or that their population outgrew their means of sustenance. Whether it was agriculture, and at some point they see evidence that maybe they were reverting to hunting and gathering, and some of this might be because random change in the climate. In this case, one that they had nothing to do with. I mean, no one could argue that the Anasazi caused climate change. They were too small in numbers and impacts, but, it didn't have to be, something they caused, but it's something that affected them, and they had to adapt, and they did. But whether they adapted at the same, locked in the same level of civilization, if you can still use that old-fashioned idea, and brought it with them, or whether they sort of, reverted down the ladder, people would argue about.
The way there's this very popular idea in the green community now that climate change leads to conflict, leads to large-scale war, dissension, and that this is how civilizations often collapse, and the Anasazi are often cited as an example of that. And what bothers me is that it leads to this kind of deterministic prediction that global warming in our future could lead to much more war. There are a lot of environmentalists who are saying this. I think we might have talked about this in the past. Bill McKibben has embraced this idea. And the problem is that this is something that I've looked into myself in studying war, and the evidence for it is actually really flimsy. So, of course you can find examples of societies where, let's say, there was a heat wave and a drought and crop collapses and so forth. And then that might be followed by civil conflict, warfare, whatever. But then there are many other conflicts where you don't get that pattern at all, and where people might have droughts and resolve their problems. And
Yeah.
so, what I don't like is the idea that when these environmental changes happen, then very deterministically humans are going to start fighting each other, because
Yeah,
that's
just
not
out
what
of
happens.
yeah, that it'll necessarily happen that way.
Right, and what
Yeah.
worries me is that there are people who are vested in that idea, either because they want to scare the shit out of us and get
Well, yeah.
reductions in fossil fuel consumption, or in the case of the Pentagon, which is all over this idea, that they want another excuse for boosting their budgets in
Well,
the
sure. Yeah, you got to
post-Cold
be
War
ready
era.
for the climate wars, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
If they're
Yeah,
going
and
to
of
be
course then it
climate,
becomes a self-fulfilling one of those self-fulfilling prophecies.
yeah.
Yeah. Now, is
Um,
that downward causation?
yeah, but this is another reason why I'm so keen
Yeah.
on getting people to believe in free will, that I want us to take responsibility for our own future instead of thinking that we're at the mercy of climatic
Yeah.
environmental shifts.
Yeah.
One other thing, we're closing in on an hour.
Hey.
I wanted you to quickly tell us about you had a Chernobyl column within the last
Oh,
month or
that's
so.
right. That was since, I think we did talk about it before.
We talked
Oh
about you
no,
going to
then that was the
Chernobyl.
National Geographic story. Yeah, we did talk
Yeah.
about that. Yeah, and then I wrote one of my raw data columns about something else that I saw in Chernobyl that I didn't put in my article, which was the ruins of this amazing old Soviet radar antenna that was constructed during the Cold War. This mammoth, steel framework that's on the grounds of Chernobyl within the so-called zone of exclusion, and now it's an abandoned ruin. But it was an early warning, part of the early warning system to warn them of a preemptive nuclear strike by the United States, and it was
Uh-huh.
just so eerie walking through the ruins of this place, which came to be called the Woodpecker because of the weird sound of the interference that it caused on shortwave radio dials, and
Uh-huh.
ham radio operators were trying to figure out what this was, and it was eventually triangulated to somewhere in Ukraine, which turned out to be just a little south of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I kind of used this. I wanted to write about this. Originally I tried to get it into my National Geographic story, and it was just one of these things that you have in your mind and in your notes, and you're just waiting for a chance to use it. So I kind of used it as an excuse to just talk about memories of the Cold War and nuclear destruction, and how we've become a little smug about that being over, and yet there's still this huge number of nuclear warheads in the world, and in a much more unstable, much less stable position, since we have gone from two nuclear powers holding each other hostage through mutual assured destruction to having, what is it, 9? At least,
think-
nuclear possessors. Whether they can all be called powers is another
I think
question.
that's
But
right.
it's scary.
Yeah.
But we don't get scared about it anymore in general,
Yeah, my students, most of them never think about nuclear weapons. They certainly
Yeah.
didn't. They certainly didn't agonize over them, have nightmares about them the way that we did when we were growing up. And yeah, you're right. There's still there's still
Yeah.
sufficient nuclear weapons out there to destroy civilization many times over.
There was this, yeah. There was this collective, yeah.
So I was just going to say, relations between the U.S. and Russia are not so great right now.
Right.
And,
Right.
Obama just decided within the last couple of months that we needed to overhaul our nuclear arsenal.
Right.
And which really, it bothers the hell out of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just figure that is not, I just don't see that as the right move. And I thought, he was the guy that was going to take us significantly toward a nuclear-free world.
Yeah.
And maybe that was unrealistic. That was naive on my part.
Yeah,
to
but it's
believe
just one of
that.
those things that fell off the table. And
Yeah.
And yeah, but yeah, and then of course, if you believe if we believe that the former Soviet Union, now Russia, is modernizing their stockpile, then once again, you get into tit for tat and mutual assured destruction with the addition of all these other potential actors, and yeah, and yet there's not this sense of widespread, there's this nuclear anxiety that was part of culture back then, with movies like Doctor Strangelove and
On the Beach.
On the Beach, right?
That was a depressing movie, my God.
That last scene with the telegraph key,
yeah,
hooked to the window shade, and they think they found a signal of life.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's another problem. Before we getting back to
that's
Paradise.
what I was saying. I need a dose of this Wilsonian optimism.
Right. Yeah. I see it as a technical problem. We cannot use these weapons. They make no sense. The United States has got to take the lead, and Obama was the right person to do it, and obviously he doesn't have time to do anything serious in that regard. Maybe he can pull something out of his hat. I'd love to see that, but it's probably going to be up. Yeah, so but we got to solve that. I don't think you can call it paradise if there's still 10,000 hydrogen bombs out there, circulating around the world.
Yeah.
So we gotta get a handle on that.
Yeah, how the older you get, the harder it is to believe that that's really going to happen.
Oh, not in my case, George.
I think for you.
It's part of my senility that everything, all the future looks bright and rosy to me. It's actually because my eyesight is getting worse, I think.
Oh, well, yeah. But isn't there a part of you, though, that just has this horrible thought that, let's say Obama somehow does this, that he comes up with some legal argument where he can make an executive order to eliminate the nuclear stockpile, and then the missiles start, what's left of the intercontinental ballistic missiles from Russian soil come, zooming over and start taking out the cities one by one.
Well, I'm not. I don't think I'm so much of a pacifist that I would advocate unilateral disarmament at this point. But I certainly think it's possible to
ratchet down.
Have radical reduction.
Yeah, I do too.
And a plan for total eradication with verification. You got to have mechanisms to make sure that people aren't cheating. And that to me, it's just that cheating makes no sense, especially by the superpowers. Then you got to watch out for little terrorist groups, people concocting their own like fission bombs or whatever. That's always going to be a problem. You're going to need some kind of global surveillance system and intelligence people who are good enough to recognize a problem when it's arising. But those are technical problems.
Yeah.
I think they're totally solvable. But you have to have the will. You have to have the free will, George.
The free will, and also the collective will.
Yeah.
Right. From the two great nuclear powers, and now things are moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah. But I'm actually encouraged that China doesn't seem to be all that interested in spending a big part of its national budget and building up a gigantic nuclear arsenal. I think they only have 200 or 300 nuclear weapons, which is it's a lot. But it's
compared to they're not going for parity with the two other superpowers.
Their policy, I've got a wonderful nuclear expert at Stevens, this guy named Alex Wellerstein, who's got a really popular blog called Nuclear Secrecy. He knows everything about the history of nuclear weapons. And he says that China is very, very explicit that that nuclear weapons will only be used to defend themselves against an invasion. They would never carry out a preemptive strike, never attack another nation.
Yeah.
So and they only need a few for that. And I wish that would be a good first step for the U.S. and Soviet Union.
Yeah. Christmas wishes.
Right.
Yeah.
Christmas wishes. Yes.
Well, I'm gonna try to absorb some of your optimism.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll try to be a little more realistic on my end.
Oh no! Don't do that.
All right,
too much
man.
of that.
Yeah, I guess. Well, we're at an hour, I see.
Yeah,
and,
we should wrap it up and maybe do it sooner than later. Another one of these, not in 3 months, but maybe
sure
between now and then.
Well, we could wait until something happens in science. It's been a little slow lately.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, we need to discover those. Supersymmetry or extra dimensions or something.
We need to discover 10-dimensional supersymmetric cyclons.
Yeah, okay. Well, here's to that in the new year.
Okay, George. All the best.
Have a good one.
Bye.